Namaste, viewers. Welcome to Jaipur Dialogue USA, and it is wonderful to connect with you again. Today, we want to talk about a very interesting topic. Living in America as I do, coming to America as I did in 1991 to bring India's story here. You know, I have seen America for a very long time now, interacted at various levels, but there is always a reservation that people have about India. To talk about this subject matter, I have wonderful pleasure of welcoming Professor Salvatore Babones from Australia. Salvatore, greetings and welcome to Jaipur Dialogue USA. By the way, I must let you know that Jaipur Dialogue USA is the sister unit of Jaipur Dialogue India. So Sanjay Dikshit ji and myself, we do show every week, and this is also with the intent and purpose to carry the narrative that the West is dealing with us Indians and NRIs, all this goes well. Now, to the audience of Jaipur Dialogue, Professor Salvatore Babones does not need an introduction, and I'm not going to do that because he has been on many shows and he's a very well-known name ever since he did his fabulous India Conclave presentation in which he was brutally frank, remarkably politically incorrect in calling out the Indian intellectuals of their own bankruptcy of thoughts and ideas. You recently wrote an article. So without going into the past, I want to dwell upon your recent article that you wrote, Why Does the West Hate India? Living here, I feel it, but I notice something else. It's out of lack of awareness and knowing. To some extent, as an Indian who has marketed India in this part of the world, I take responsibility because I haven't told them. Indians have never talked about their Sanatan principles. Forget about proselytization. We have not even shared the thought that who we are. So when you talk about, I read your article, very fascinating, to the point, and remarkably accurate from my point of view. And where I disagree, we'll come to that later stage. Sure. So go ahead. Tell me your thoughts and how you got inspired to do this.
First, I should be clear that authors don't write headlines. So I never said that the West hates India. And in fact, right. I don't believe that the West hates India. The article appeared in First Post and was recently reprinted by First Post, emphasizing that there is a new anti-Hinduism that has spread throughout the West. And it is a resurrection, if you will, of an old anti-Hinduism. There's been anti-Hinduism going all the way back to, of course, the British Raj. And everyone's familiar with Winston Churchill's famously derogatory racist remarks about Mahatma Gandhi. But his remarks were not exceptional for his time and class. What's troubling is that those kind of thoughts, although they're not expressed today, we'll never see that kind of blatant racist language used. We do see a lot of the same class of people, by which I mean upper class people in Britain, upper class people in the northeastern United States, academics, intellectuals, who seem to be reflexively anti-Hindu and by extension anti-India. Ironically, seeing India as the Hindu state that they criticize it for being. And it's actually very ironic. The anti-India activism I see that's motivated or seemingly motivated by anti-Hinduism, which is connected with the same people who criticize India for becoming, in their view at least, less secular and more Hindu. So there's always irony when it comes to people's prejudices. But this prejudice is something I see in Australia, in academia. So it's no coincidence that academic writing on on India in Australia tends to be vehemently critical. And in the article, I highlighted the fact that we've seen this before. That is, we've seen this playbook used against Israel. It's the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic playbook that is now being applied to India by many of the literal same people, by the same sorts of organizations, peace, quote unquote, peace research organizations, departments of peace studies, by Qatari-based Muslim Brotherhood related organizations like the Middle East Eye, like Al Jazeera, connected with some of the, frankly, very upper crust British establishment venues as well. It really is dismaying, but not really surprising to see this return of old tropes coming back to haunt us again.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which, we have both experienced this anti-Hindu thing in the Western world. And what intrigues me and what worries me both at the same time is the fact that India is a remarkably vibrant democracy. Our Sanatan principles are essentially democratic in nature. And when I read recently that Rahul Gandhi, at the end of his yatra, so to say, journey in Kashmir, he talked about he's not doing it for himself, he's doing it to bring secular practices back. And I was wondering, and he was blaming the BJP and RSS as, making India a Hindu nation. And I was wondering, I'm a Hindu, a very proud Hindu. And I thought about that article. I said, you do not demand secular practices from Muslims and Christians in India. Is the responsibility of being secular only on Hindus? Or have you not thought about that how secularism has practices the way it was practiced? Nothing wrong with the word secularism. There is nothing wrong with religion. I always say that the way things get practiced or in play, that's what it is. In soccer, no ball gets penalized. But but if you bowl a bouncer, it will go for a 6 or it will hit ahead. But the question is how the play is being translated into real life. That is what is causing a problem. I'm a believer that Hindus need a renaissance and a revolution both at the same time. But here is a thought that comes to my mind. Why is it that democracies are more anti-India than there are other countries? Why they can't see that a country like India with 1.3 billion people, chaotic democracy, call it as you wish, it's your ally. It's your biggest ally.
First, I try not to wade into Indian domestic politics. It may not seem like that if you read my Twitter feed, but if you read my Twitter feed carefully, I don't have any political opinions about India or about the status of Indian secularism. I'm simply observing that India is a majority Hindu state, and much as the United States and Australia celebrate Christmas as a national holiday, it's nothing particularly anti-democratic or indeed anti-secular for example, for Indians to recognize that India has an overwhelming Hindu majority. That said, there are legitimate differences of opinion within India, and I really want to stress, I don't take any position on those. I highlight hypocrisy when I see it. I put things in comparative perspective, but I don't have a position on that. That's now, on Western views about India, again, I want to stress, Western countries are not anti-India. Western populations are not anti-India. A small group within Western elites are anti-India. And that small group can only, to my mind, be motivated by the same kinds of irrational considerations that lead virtually the same small group to be so vehemently anti-Israel. Which is to say that there's no really rational basis for the anti-India vehemence of a small group of Western intellectuals who have no real connection to India or to Islam or to the Hindu-Muslim conflicts that have gone on for more than 1,000 years, but who nonetheless seem to feel very passionately about it. Again, it may sound strange to hear from me. Honestly, I don't feel very passionate about India. I'm an academic intellectual. I study India the same way I've studied China, the same way in the future I'll study other countries. It's just a case for analysis for me. And thus, I'm really surprised when I see colleagues. Again, I want to emphasize a small sliver of colleagues within the humanities and social sciences. If you go to business academia, management studies, if you go to other areas of academia, certainly if you go to engineering and medicine, you see very much a positive story about India. And if you go outside academia to wider society, I think people have a very positive impression about India. Now, I'm not Indian or Hindu, so I don't have the lived experience of knowing how people react in the US or in Australia to being Indian or Hindu. But I would ask you, if you allow me to turn around the interview, I assume that ordinary Americans harbor no ill will or discrimination towards you for being very proudly Indian American. I mean, have you experienced anything from ordinary Americans?
No, personally speaking, never. That's what I'm saying. You are absolutely right. As we say sometimes that extremes drive the middle. The extremes build the narrative. What gets read in Washington Post and New York Times, that becomes the general impression of the people who read that article. So
So you brought up the Washington Post, New York Times, and I'll add the Wall Street Journal. And
yes,
what we see in all of those venues, on the part of the editors, is a credulity about negative stories about India or about Indian Hindus. It's not that the editors themselves seem to have a strong stance. It's that the editors seem very willing to allow activists to leverage their pages to present messages that are really not only are factually incorrect, but would be questioned if they were written by others. So if a patriotic Hindu Indian, young male Hindu flag-waving Indian wanted to write an op-ed for the Washington Post, he would almost certainly be rejected. However, when a female Muslim activist, so I'm here talking about Rana Ayub, who's become very prominent, when she wants to write, well, she's given a quarterly column, regular spot in the newspaper. Now, I have nothing, and again, I'm an outsider, and I very much respect Rana Ayub's right to have an opinion about her own country.
You don't have to clarify each time you say
something. I always want to be clear about this because many people like to present me on Twitter or in social media in a way. I want to be very clear. I fully respect her legitimate right to write about her country and to have opinions about her country. It's her country, not my country. What I find bizarre and troubling is not what she writes about India, but that the Washington Post would take it as authoritative. That the Washington Post presents her not as a human rights activist who has a political agenda, but as a journalist who's presenting objective fact about India, that they don't fact check her articles. So I've written for major American publications. My articles always go through a very rigorous fact checking. So if I make a claim, if I say something as anodyne as Narendra Modi is wildly popular in India, okay, everyone knows that Narendra Modi is wildly popular in India. But if I make that statement, an editor will call me up on it and say, do you have evidence to back that up? What about these people who don't like Narendra Modi? Right? So I'll get that pushback from editors. Her very transparently activist motivated articles not only get through the editorial review process without apparently having, without having that kind of skepticism applied to them, but then when the Washington Post writes editorials, they take the knowledge or the information they believe they have gained from this sort of writer and use it as knowledge about India. Now, it's not just this one person. A Hindu think tanker, Dume, Sanandan Dume, okay, writes for the Wall Street Journal. Now, he again is not he's a perfectly respectable public intellectual. He's very knowledgeable. He's very good in his own field. But he has a very strong political agenda. Now, here we're not talking about anti-Hinduism. Again, he had, and nor do I think Rana Ayub is motivated by anti-Hinduism. I want to be very clear. I'm not labeling these authors. But when he writes something that is effectively anti-Hindu India, okay, that is, in effect, he's writing in a way that is suggesting that that the state embrace of Hinduism in India is deeply troubling for him. When he writes about this, it's accepted as fact by the Wall Street Journal editors, instead of questioned at every point. Again, because it fits an anti-Hindu narrative. And again, I know I've said this a dozen times. I want to be very clear. The people I'm specifically identifying as being anti-Hindu and anti-India are not the Indians who are writing about their own country. It's the editors, it's the academics, it's the wider Western intellectual infrastructure that is so keen to pick up one message and would never entertain publishing an opposing message. They're the ones who have the irrational approach to India. That Indians would have strong opinions about India is entirely rational. That Western editors would suspend their skepticism when they see something critical, but apply extreme skepticism when they see something positive. That to me is evidence of a troubling bias.
And why do you think that troubling bias? I totally agree with you, because applying different standards of editorial necessities uh, is very troubling. And that's the reason why one wonders, what is the motive? Who drives that agenda of the mighty editors and the people who matter? Because that becomes unfair practice. It becomes unethical journalism. It becomes peddling lies. It becomes brandishing untruths. So then, what is wrong in questioning that? Because when we question that, then Rana, you will say, with due respect to you, Rana, you will say that, oh, my freedom of speech is being curtailed. Is it because people are playing the game of democracy better than we are playing? Because as the famous statement goes, democracy is for people who subscribe to that point of view. But those who do not subscribe to that point of view for one reason or the other, it's not meant for them. I can't play baseball with a cricket bat and vice versa. So the question is that how does one come to terms with it? How does one deal with it? Because there is no dialogue, there is no debate, there is no conversation, me, my way or highway. But I'm concerned about that institutional framework, those few who drive the narrative. What must we do? From your point of view, as a sociological analysis, to persuade them that you are wrong. And from my point of view, as an Indian, as a Hindu, as an American, I'm drawn in conflict because that's not me.
First, let's remember that nobody plays democracy better than Narendra Modi. He's the one winning the elections. Okay, so it's precisely the people who've been vilified. It's Narendra Modi, it's Yogi Adityanath, who are playing democracy very effectively. What the critics are doing is playing intellectual critique very effectively. So they're demonizing democracy within a very small sliver of society. They're demonizing Indian democracy, but they're doing that very successfully. And this is an important and influential sliver of society. So, for example, in the United States, when academics around the country got together virtually online to run a dismantling global Hindutva conference, okay, that represents a very widespread organization of academics from across dozens of universities to demonize a movement that, look, again, I tell people I'm not Hindu. I'm not a Hindu activist. I have no personal sympathy to Hindutva as a philosophy or as an approach. But I've read an awful lot about Hindutva. I've read the original sources. There's nothing particularly unpalatable or negative or remarkable about Hindutva. Yes, there's some people who are Hindutva activists who may commit crimes and do inappropriate things. Well, there are many people who are Islamists who may commit crimes and do inappropriate things. There are many people who are, and I can insert any social movement. There are many Antifa activists, many Black Lives Matter activists who commit crimes and do bad things. So there's always a fringe of any movement who take it too far and do things that are inappropriate and often illegal. But broadly speaking, Hindutva is a perfectly ordinary national rejuvenation movement that we see in many developing countries. It's not exceptional. Now, I'm sorry if that offends anybody who is Hindu, and for them it's exceptional because it's their approach. But it's just like saying that Hinduism itself is exceptional. To me, as a sociologist, it's not exceptional. There's Hinduism, there's Christianity, there's Shinto, right? To me, they're just all religions. Okay. So the fact that this conference was so successful in mobilizing academics against what is really just an ordinary developing country rejuvenation movement is, to me, evidence. It's unobservable evidence. I can't get at their personal opinions, but it is evidence of a prejudice, of a mindset that is very similar. I mean, if you look at the Dismantling Global Hindutva website on Wayback Machine on the archive, it is so similar to anti-Zionist conferences, to anti-Zionist mobilization, and in many cases, the very same organizations that joined the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference had previously been involved in anti-Zionist activism. Now, again, I'm not Jewish. I take no position on the question of Zionism. I simply observe that anti-Zionism is often held so vehemently by people who have no connection to Israel or the Palestinian question that it must be a acceptable front for anti-Semitism. And I'm not alone in that judgment. That's a widely held view. Even the BBC explainer on anti-Zionism points out that anti-Zionism is often a legitimate front for anti-Semitism. Well, in the same way, anti-Hindutva activism is very often just a legitimate sounding front for anti-Hinduism. And it's the same problem. I can't point to any one person and say, this person is motivated by anti-Hinduism, but this person is genuinely just anti-Hindutva, right? And that's why it's used, because it's something where you can have a legitimate looking front for a reprehensible underlying attitude.
I love your explanation. And I wanted to also check and ask and inquire with you is, to what extent your study of Hinduism and Hindutva, as you have very accurately put it, is responsible for the elites, elites in both global Islamists and the Western elites colluding? You mentioned that in your article, which
Yes.
has been reprinted. How does this holy alliance come to be formed? And
the unholy alliance, as I call it in an upcoming paper. Look, first, people may notice I haven't named names. Yes. And the reason I haven't named names is not just a fear of being sued. It's because, again, you can't know for certain whether a particular person is motivated by prejudice or is motivated by genuine concern. And because you can't know for certain, I don't want to blame any one person. But broadly speaking, there is a bizarre alliance, that is a bizarre readiness of Western intellectuals to take up Islamist causes with which they would otherwise seemingly have no sympathy. So Islamism, global Islamism in general, is profoundly illiberal. It is strongly associated with violence and terrorism. It's not to say everyone involved is a terrorist, but there's strong associations. Muslim civil society organizations, even Muslim mosques, are often used as public recruiting grounds for terrorism. That's not me saying, that's police reports saying that. And these are things we all know. Right? So we all know that it is, again, not everywhere, not routine, not all mosques, but there is a high level of tolerance within global Islamism for violence towards Israel, for violence towards India, violence on the Kashmir question. And these are things that most Western liberals would ordinarily condemn. That is, Western liberals would ordinarily not want to be associated with these kinds of organizations and causes. Yet, to the extent that those causes are anti-Israel, I often see that organizations and individuals Western organizations and individuals are willing to cooperate. And now emerging in the last 20 years or so is, to the extent that those organizations are anti-India, the same Western organizations and universities. I mean, the worst example of this, I mean, the one that you find constantly popping up, Western University Peace Research Centers. Now, again, I'm not going to name any particular peace research center, because obviously any particular one, and people at it have legitimate motivations. It's not like peace research as a field exists to be anti-Semitic or exists to be anti-Hindu. But there's an awful lot of anti-Semitism and there's an awful lot of anti-Hinduism at peace research centers in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, and the UK. Okay, why would these peace research centers take up alliances with thoroughly unpeaceful Islamist organizations and individuals? It's a bizarre marriage. Now, that's the first one, the Western Peace Research Center, and broadly speaking, Western academia embracing these kinds of unpalatable organizations. The second place in the West we see this is with Christian missionary movements. Now, again, I come from a Christian background, but I'm not personally Christian. I'm atheistic. But I'm very aware of movements in Christianity. I follow Christianity reasonably well. I write about Christianity pretty often. Obviously, Christianity is a religion dedicated to peace. And I think much more explicitly, if you'll forgive my saying, much more explicitly than any global religion with which I'm aware, Christianity is absolutely dedicated to peace as a philosophy. That said, Christian missionary groups in India have shown, and their supporters, I should say, it's not so much the Christian missionaries in India, their supporters in the United States have shown a willingness to ally with violence-adjacent Islamist groups. Now, Christianity and Islam have been fighting for longer than Hinduism and Islam have been fighting. It goes back well before the Crusades. Remember, places like Syria, Egypt, those were bastions of Christianity. I mean, St. Paul experienced his conversion on the road to Damascus. So these are places that 1,500 years ago, or almost 1,500 years ago, were conquered by Islam. There's been conflict between Christianity and Islam for well over 1,000 years. Yet there's a strange willingness to work across these communal divides when it comes to demonizing Hinduism. Now, I find that, again, just very odd. It's something that, it's one of these no smoke without fire situations where, again, I don't want to name any particular individual because any particular Christian missionary may be entirely motivated by a desire to spread the good news of the gospel. Any particular Christian missionary, all the Christian missionaries I've personally met are wonderful people who just want to make the world a better place. Many Christian missionaries are absolutely dedicated to doing good works without actually doing any proselytizing. And you may be surprised by that, but I personally am aware of Christian missionaries in Somalia who are literally not allowed to tell people they're Christian, but they still do the good work. Right? So there's a lot of goodwill here. The odd thing is when a small number of Christian missionaries are willing to work with violence adjacent, people who advocate terrorism and war, but only when it has to do with being anti-India. Okay, that again strikes me as suspicious. So it's this bizarre alliance, and if anyone's listening very carefully, you'll notice I've not called Muslims anti-Hindu, which is to say, I think many, for example, Kashmiri Muslims who want a separate state. I don't endorse that. I don't endorse violence. It's not my business whether Kashmir should be a separate state or should be part of India. That's none of my business. I don't find it particularly anti-Hindu if a Kashmiri Muslim wants independence for Kashmir. I mean, that's a political goal. The bizarre thing is when an American Christian missionary wants independence for Kashmir. Then you say, why in the world is there this connection? That I can only attribute not to a specific political goal for Kashmir, but to a broader anti-Hinduism.
That's right. The other thing which you brought up the subject of Christian missionaries in India, and these days, thanks to technology, we get to see things much quicker. It doesn't have to be on a newspaper 3 days later or 5 days later, one picture, one editorial. We can see visuals of things, and they're doing crazy things. I mean, virtually people behave as if they have been electrocuted and all that kind of stuff for conversion. I have a human issue here, and I seek an answer for that. You are a Christian, I'm a Hindu. We are believer. You know what we believe in. Go pray, don't pray, doesn't matter. So long as you are defined by what you do, not what you say. And that's our essential belief. Your actions determine who you are. Is conversion, and earlier I had mentioned, there is nothing wrong in anything except the way it gets implemented and introduced in the societies that we live in. Is conversion, and this is a sociological issue, is conversion a sin against God's original intent? Imagine me asking this question to you in a classroom. Mm-hmm. Is conversion a sin against God's original intent? Because God is the ultimate creator, magician, call him anything. With a blink of an eye, he could have made me a Peter, and he could have made Salvatore a Saifuddin. But it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. We are who we are because of varieties of reasons. Is conversion, somewhere along the line, a trick word to impose one way or the other way on people or unsuspecting for one reason or the other?
Well, look, you're talking to an atheist sociologist who has a Christian, who comes from a Christian culture and is very familiar with Christianity, but who's not himself Christian. That said, it's very clear that in Christianity, there is the injunction to spread the good news, that is to spread the gospel. And that injunction is taken very seriously by many people. I can't blame Christians for wanting to engage in missionary activity, for wanting to convert people. In fact, I've given the example in my own class that if you're actually Christian, in my own introduction to sociology classes, that if you're really Christian, in theory, instead of spending time studying for class, you should be spending your time trying to convert your people to the left and right of you in class, since that's the injunction. If you truly believe that anyone who does not hear the good news is going to burn for hell for eternity, any well-meaning, sympathetic person would try to convert others. That said, we have to live in society. So I use this example in class not to deride or make fun of my Christian students, but to emphasize how we have to live in society. So we don't do that in class. Why? Because we're aware of the need to live together in society. So I don't particularly view it as illiberal of India, and it's certainly not as repressing international religious freedom in India, if India has parameters around which conversion could occur. In fact, I've gone back and read the Constituent Assembly debates on this. I'm not convinced that the Indian Constitution protects the right of proselytization. The wording there is very careful. It's propagation, not proselytization. Correct. Propagation in ordinary English usage means you can give it to your children. That is, the state will not stop you from, in your family, training your children religiously. And my own reading of the Indian Constituent Assembly debates is that at the time, the view in the Constituent Assembly was that this word was chosen because it means that the state will not stop Christians or Muslims from raising their children as Christian and Muslim. Now, it's since been expanded in Indian usage to mean a protection for proselytization. I don't see that there. That's an historical question. There's certainly protections for proselytization in today's India. But I bring this up because I want to say, even were India to do what the shrill anti-India opponents say, that is, even if India were to simply outlaw proselytization, I would view that as a legitimate civil approach to religious freedom. That is, religious freedom does not imply the freedom to convert. Now, I know many people feel differently about that. There are different interpretations of what religious freedom is, but our international understanding of religious freedom, the consensus viewpoint, is obviously very much conditioned on the Christian origins of international law. So had international law derived in India and then spread to the rest of the world, it's very likely that it would contain a requirement for religious toleration, place toleration as the greatest value, which would then say not interfering with other people's religion would be the true respect for human rights. That is, proselytization could very well be seen as an infringement on human rights. So as someone who's comes from a civil perspective, a secular perspective, who's not invested in these debates, I tell both sides, look, you could just as well create a narrative that a liberal international legal environment would prohibit proselytization, or at least frown on it, that is just as consistent with liberal secular values as an international law that protects proselytization. We could derive either from basic liberal secular principles. And I'm agnostic, there's that word, I'm agnostic about which approach should be taken. And in my writing on India, I haven't so much advocated India's approach as defended and contextualized India's approach. Which is to say, I'm not saying India's approach is correct. I'm saying India's approach is well within the realm of liberal secular approaches to competition between religions.
Religion, I mean, I have said it on my LinkedIn profile. God created the universe and some smart aleck created religion and divided the people. So religion as practiced is the problem, in my opinion. I pray and I don't pray. I'm very God-loving. I don't fear God. I love God because He created me. So my relationship with my God is very different than the God-fearing part. But interesting part here is, again, science and technology has really removed the veil of ignorance and fear. We now know that thunder and lightning don't happen because gods are angry. We now know that men are responsible for the gender determination of the child, of the baby, of the infant. My inquiry here is, again, is the growth in science and science and technology, the vast array of things that are happening right now, that is it hurting religious expansionism or the religious citadel of the people who matter? Because
Oh,
religion
here
is
you're
a
getting
lot of conflicts.
you're getting way beyond any area where I have any expertise. So I'll end my commentary on religion. Look, I'm interested in civil laws about religion,
Okay.
but the nature of religion and the nature of God, you'll have to
No, I'm not
go to
talking,
someone
I'm talking about the fact
more
that
wise than me.
no. Evolution in science and technology. Mine also is a learning. I'm not a sociologist. I personally believe that we live a life. You and I, we all have ears, nose, eyes. All women all over the world take 9 months to deliver a biologically normal child. There is no distinction. Then, in the sociological evolution of mankind, is religion hurting the growth of mankind? That's what I'm saying. Or is it creating more conflict? That's the inquiry that I want to have. And I want to debate and I want to talk
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
I'm a Durkheimian here. If anyone's ever read Emile Durkheim, the founding father of sociology, you'll know that he took what's called a functionalist perspective to society. I view religion as being highly functional for society. That is, I think that religion is something that binds society together and that is broadly supportive, is broadly pro-social. I freely admit that by being atheist, in a way that makes me to some degree antisocial. It seems strange to but I can't make myself believe simply because I think it would be better for society if we all believed. But no, I'm a great respecter of religion, a great admirer of religion, and I do feel that religion, virtually all religions, all mainstream religions certainly, play a pro-social role. That is, they're good for society.
Yes. Yes, it is always the few. Like I said earlier, it is the extremes that drive the middle, and that's where the problem arises. Is that when you and I become politically correct because we don't seek reprisal in the individual capacity. Coming to the other interesting thing that you talked about, the institutional hatred. Now, what must be done about it? Is one thing. One of my favorite statements is, we can talk about any issue for as long as we want. But the question is, knowing what we know, where do we go from here? What must the Hindu do to set right this hate? And in the group of Western elites and Islamists, we must add the Marxist as well. That's another spice added to the entire dialogue. What must an ordinary Hindu do? Because we are all individual targets. Nupur Sharma is an individual target. Whereas, the fact checker is roaming the streets of Delhi at his will, Nupur Sharma lives a life of, in hiding.
Yeah.
That is the main thing that is also a troublesome thing. Your thoughts?
Unfortunately, you have to organize, and here I would point you to the Jewish model. Unfortunately, and it is very unfortunate, Jews have had to organize as a community to fight anti-Semitism. Now, there shouldn't be anti-Semitism, and if they simply said anti-Semitism is wrong, I mean, look at the Holocaust, look how terrible it is, you shouldn't do it. Well, unfortunately, that's not enough, and they would still face anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is there; it's not going to go away, and they organize to fight it, to call it out, to push back. Unfortunately, now that Hinduism has gone global, Hindus in the diaspora have to organize to fight anti-Hinduism, and that's already happening. There's the Hindu American Foundation. There's a coalition of Hindus of North America. I don't know what other the VHP, the World Hindu Council. is organized, and you just need more of it. I mean, here in Australia, there have been a series of defacements of Hindu temples in Melbourne over the last few weeks, with graffiti and anti-Hindu slogans being spray painted on them. Well, that's so reminiscent of exactly what we see at Jewish temples and synagogues, of anti-Semitic people putting scrawling hate messages or spray painting hate messages on synagogues. It's become routine for Jews, and they just know that it's routine, and they constantly have to fight back at it. Now, I'm very sorry that this affects Hindus as well, but it's becoming routine for Hindus. And I would say organize now to fight back against it. Make sure that you have, every temple should have a public affairs officer who knows the phone number for the local police department and the local reporter of the local newspaper. And you shouldn't have to have this. Churches don't generally have this, because churches, Christian churches in Western societies, don't face this sort of routine, low-level property, crimes against property. But increasingly Hindu temples and Hindu organizations do. So you have to organize, you have to be prepared, and people are doing that. It's unfortunate, but it's just the reality of the situation.
No, this is bothersome, because as one senator once told me, that we love you Indians as immigrants to this country. You are professionals, you are hardworking, you are in the highest income bracket. You are doing well, you have family values, you take care of your children, you are not a law and order problem anywhere, yet we are the target in these 21st century.
Yeah.
What could be the reason for that? What is it? Is it our success?
As I said, no, I don't think, because Hindus are not the target of hatred of ordinary peoples. And this is why I distinguish between a lot of Hindu organizations get upset that I keep making this distinction, but I distinguish between anti-Hinduism and Hinduphobia. So phobias are widespread. There's widespread Islamophobia. Muslims, I guarantee you, Muslims in America, Muslims in Australia face widespread popular Islamophobia, by which I mean, if there are a group of Muslims who are overtly, visibly identifiable as Muslims on the train, people will move away from them. If they're Muslims at the beach, ordinary Australians will mutter about it. There's violence at the beach in Australia has broken out between ordinary Australian, white Australian youth and Muslim youth at the beach. There's a lot of fear of Islam. Now, whether that fear is sometimes rational, sometimes irrational, let's leave that aside. It is genuine fear, and it's popular. It's widespread. Islamophobia, if you look at American society, Islamophobia is a popular phenomenon, and fighting Islamophobia is an elite phenomenon. So the American elite is united in condemning Islamophobia. The phenomenon is popular. The condemnation is coming from elites. Look at anti-Semitism or anti-Hinduism. These are not popular movements. As you admitted, there's no widespread popular anti-Hinduism in America. If you went into any Christian church in America today and you said, I'm a Hindu, I'd like to tell you about this, they would say, oh, Hindu, that's the religion with all the gods, right? They would be surprised, they may be interested, but they would not look at you as someone to fear. They would look at you as someone to learn from, to be interested in. They'd try to convert you, but they wouldn't be afraid of you. There's not widespread Hindu phobia in America, in Australia, in the West today. Instead, there is a very thin layer of elite anti-Hinduism, which is not being condemned by the elite because it's coming from the elite. So it's a very different dynamic, where with Muslims in America, the Islamophobia is popular, and the entire American elite is united in condemning Islamophobia. Yet with anti-Hinduism, there's virtually no popular anti-Hinduism. It all comes from a number of elite institutions, which is why the elite, the intellectual elite, does not condemn anti-Hinduism, because it's emanating from their own social class.
Okay, again, back to the classroom. I'm a perpetual learner, and I'll ask you a student's question. Why is this super elite anti-Hindu?
I think a lot of it is historical. So even though today most of the Anglo-American elite is itself non-religious, there still is that historical vestige of a aversion to heathenism, that we, and I don't use heathenism, by the way, as a slur. I use it just in its descriptive theological sense.
I understand.
And anti-heathenism that dates back to colonialism. And when the British and Portuguese first arrived, Muslims were a known enemy. That is, they worship the same God, but Muslims are not heathens in the Christian perspective. Right. Muslims are heretics in the Christian perspective. That is, they're members of the family who've gone astray. Right. Versus, Hindus are something very foreign, and that initial just unwillingness to disrespect for Hindu institutions, I think carried over a lot into elite British society. So you have this, for example, if you think of the Lawrence of Arabia phenomenon, there's a romanticization of Islam. What Edward Said called an orientalization of Islam. Now, Edward Said meant that in a negative way, but nonetheless, it is in a way a love-hate relationship. But Muslims are seen as being the legitimate enemy of Christianity, in a way that, for example, Jews were not. Jews were the traitors who, in anti-Semitic slurs, were said to have killed Jesus.
Right.
Okay, that same kind of aversion to Jews that we saw throughout the Middle Ages, and there's a real connection between Middle Age anti-Jewish anti-Semitism, Martin Luther's anti-Semitism. I don't know if you're aware, Martin Luther, the Reformation leader, was thoroughly anti-Semitic in his writing. Carries through to today and to the Holocaust in Germany, even though the people who committed the Holocaust were not themselves religious. It was a social phenomenon. And in the same way that British colonial anti-Hinduism, I think, carries through in elite British institutions all the way to today. There's not a romanticization of the Hindu among the British elite. Instead, there is there's very much an aversion. There is a I'm not sure what word I'm looking for. Simply put, there's an anti-Hindu sentiment. So whereas Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, 40 Nights, that's romantic. That's romantic. It's wonderful. It's magical.
Just like Robin Hood and his band of thieves.
Yeah, we don't see that same kind of romanticization of the Hindu in elite Western discourse. Instead, there's a disparagement of the Hindu in elite Western discourse, and I think it's carried over that 16th century interaction has still informed even the post-religious, post-faith Western institutions today at the elite level. Still carry that same trait within them. I can't really, I certainly don't condone it. I can't quite explain it because it's something that's very foreign to me. I mean, I really don't understand those sorts of prejudice. But the prejudice is there. I see it in the universities. I see the vehemence, the anger with which Western academics with no connection to India whatsoever condemn the VHP, condemn the RSS, condemn Narendra Modi, condemn Hindutva. And I'm thinking, why are you so angry? If you're an American professor in New Jersey, why do you care so much? And again, I can't ascribe any particular individual's motive to anti-Hinduism. All I can say is that there's too much anti-Hinduism, or there's too much anti-Hindu sentiment for it all to be simply motivated by rational motivations.
Thank you. Last inquiry with you. You have, the first time I heard you speak on the India Today conclave, and then with Sanjay Dikshitji, and we talk about the failure of Indian intellectual. That's a very, very powerful thought that you brought out.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It was a completely anodyne statement. If I said American intellectuals are anti-America, everyone would shrug their shoulders and say, of course they are. If I said Australian intellectuals are anti-Australia, everyone would shake their heads and say, yeah, of course. I thought it was very funny because I did not mean that statement to become somehow a meme. I thought it was just, everyone knows this. I mean, there's no, what debate could there be here? I was shocked that it became such that it hit such a powerful nerve, because I thought this is something everybody knows. All I'm doing is, the world is round, the sky is high, and intellectuals are anti their own country. That's everywhere. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've just been repeatedly amazed that anyone thinks this was a profound observation. It's just par for the course.
No, it is indeed par for the course. One is called criticism. It's the same kind of a difference between cynicism and skepticism. Cynicism hurts. Skepticism is good. It's good to be skeptical about things. Why take trust but verify? That's simple as that. But here is another one. When it becomes clear that somebody is doing it with an intent and purpose, you criticize me ad infinitum, but you say not a word about anybody else. And that spurs a question. All right, so I'm bad. What about the other guy? That's the kind of failure which people are beginning to question. And that's what is happening in India now, thanks to technology. People are reading Aurobindo's article. And if you haven't read it, The Bourgeois and the Samurai, a brilliant narrative. The first 3 pages, I was saying, wow, the man had wisdom to say what he said. He talked about the Indian mindset there, the samurai and the bourgeois. It's on Google. You can read it whenever you have time. Brilliant article. My question is here. You said very, very correctly that all that you need to do is to organize. And all the viewers who are watching today, take that mantra that there is no alternative today than using the technology, the tools of technology, to coordinate, cooperate, and mobilize. When you find something is wrong, do this. The 2CM policy formula that I have prescribed to all of us is to do that at an individual level, collective level, and create an institutional framework. Salvatore, it was wonderful to have you on the show today, because it's an important issue, because most of the Indians here are not sure. Why am I being hated? Because they are not engaged. So I always tell them, get engaged in the communities that you live in. If people know you, then they will know about you. If they don't know you, they won't know about you. It's simple as that. So thank you very much for being with us today. Viewers, like, subscribe, and share the good word about our channel. As I always say, truth must triumph. Satyamev Jayate, that is the Sanskrit slogan. Thank you, Salvatore. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.